Well, I have lots of questions for you, but I do want to thank you. I certainly could not have even come close to that introduction that you gave us. And lots of questions just from what you've told us, but the development, some of the issues that we have here in Walnut Creek, we're not seeing the litigious nature that we see in other cities, but we certainly have projects that are important. We're looking at future economic development. I will say we have very little snow in Walnut Creek and the fishing is not so good, but otherwise we've got lots and lots of things here in Walnut Creek that will need your attention as the community development director for our city. So you already said my first question was what inspired you to take the job, and I think you've answered that. So I'm going to talk about some of the development opportunities and what you see. You've had your boots on the ground here for several months. Because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to shake hands or see you out and about, but I know you've been very busy. So one of the first questions is, and it's one that was solicited, is Walnut Creek is an East Bay center for high-paying jobs and a go-to location for small and mid-sized company headquarters. How can we rework the application of Measure A to preserve the residential feel while facilitating higher office buildings along the North Main corridor?
That is a very challenging proposition. So Measure A was an initiative passed in the 80s. And, at the time, because it was passed, I think it reflected the values and the views of the residents and the voters at that time. And apparently there were many concerns about building height. And it seems, and, it's from without knowing in depth and in detail its history, many people tend to associate building height with just new development, right, and development capacity. So in my career, I've had some experience. I mentioned the Town Plaza project in Culver City, and it was a challenge because it turned out the constitutional law professor from Loyola Marymount lived about 100 feet from the proposed project in a historic neighborhood. And so he personally started a referendum, which is another public vote to overturn the vote of the city council. And it was a referendum against the project. And that experience was very telling. We, the city, put together a fact sheet about the pros and cons of the measure and the impacts that it would have. But the key, and it was resoundingly beaten in the election. And that was because there was such a strong and supportive community around that Town Plaza project. The Chamber of Commerce and the Downtown Business Association, which is very much what we're talking about right here, had formed and had been long engaged in the development of this project, which was meant to be the catalyst for the economic prosperity of the community and revitalization of that town. The project was put together very carefully with a lot of public input. And so when that measure, it was Save Our Schools, by the way. So when that measure came out, that strong, unified group of supporters that was led by the Chamber and the Business Association, they were able to message and share amongst the voters a different story. And ultimately, it failed at the polls. And the reason I mention that is that initiatives and referendums, those things that are done by the people are actually done by the people. And I think, a lot of time has passed since Measure A was approved. And, I think that strategically, I think you and the community should be thinking, is it relevant? Is it reflective of the now values? Because anything that would dramatically change or actually cause any change to Measure A would require a vote of the people. So it's not an easy thing to achieve. And I think everybody on this call knows that, voting is political, voting is informational and educational, and it's certainly involving polling, for example. So I think the obvious first piece is what to do with Measure A, and with any outcome to it that would be a change would require, I think, an extensive and well-developed strategy to approach it in and of itself. And that's not an easily done thing. I think everybody has seen the nature of politics over the last 8 years, and there's certainly a lot of concerns with that. The other part of your question is, how do you preserve a residential feel while facilitating higher development? You know, I think the North Downtown specific plan has painted a picture and a vision for that area. And it brings to mind that there are so many communities across the country that have a lot of development, but they're done so well that you don't focus on the development itself. You focus on the place that it has created. If you're familiar with Washington, D.C., there are so many communities like DuPont Circle in the capital area where there's a lot of office space, there's a lot of commercial, and there's a lot of residential, but the overall attention to the streetscape and to that edge has made those places desirable for people to live. So they might have a townhouse, a row house, or even a higher condominium, and there's a very rigid height limitation in the capital. But it's all put together in that office development has been scaled to fit. So I think in Walnut Creek situation, careful design, and careful design means careful design. It means integrating, working with architects, landscape architects, and applicants. It does not mean some rigid structure of rote standards that are just universally applied. It takes some care, and it certainly needs to be well thought out through a timely review process. But I think the attention that I see, I'm looking out my window right now, and I think that the streetscape here is in good shape. I think there are good bones to this community, and your past will help inform the future about what happens in the North Downtown area and how you integrate a diversity of uses. The car dealerships are important, and they can fit, and I think careful design will let them fit and be a complement to the other retail, service, and residential frontages that would sit by them. So I think it's a great opportunity. And then, of course, back to Measure A, until it's changed, it lives. But there are certainly aspects that you see changing it now. We have a number of projects that have relied on state law changes to exceed some of the height limitations that were set by Measure A. So I think that in that case, state law is allowing density bonus projects to have a bit more flexibility. So I think it needs to be carefully thought out and carefully implemented.
That's, I want to say music to our ears, the idea of the development and the work that you've done with in contentious situations. And so I think that's important. We have an issue here. We've often talked about development, but we haven't built a new office building in Walnut Creek in a number of years, and that's of concern. And that North Downtown plan that you speak of, when you think of the transportation hubs of the Walnut Creek BART station and the Pleasant Hill BART station, which we secretly don't tell Pleasant Hill about, is actually in Walnut Creek County area, but those hubs and that incredible area between. So keeping that in mind, can you tell us what development and growth opportunities do you see in that area in Walnut Creek?
I think so. I'm in town. I've been here. I'll be here for 2 weeks. I'm in my shuttling process still, and I think that when I see what's on the ground now, the residential development is really, I think, strong, and I think there are just more opportunities for residential development to find its place. The trickier part will be the office development piece. I think overall, what we see happening as a result of COVID is people are finding remote working opportunities. And, I think that's got an opportunity for Walnut Creek, but it's also potentially a risk. The flight from San Francisco, that's really an exaggeration, but, I can probably live in Des Moines, Iowa, or Walnut Creek and not necessarily have to go to a point of employment in San Francisco. And so I think that there are probably a number of different kind of office formats. What I see now are really large floor plate office spaces. And so I think there'll be an opportunity to see some smaller, more infill types of office space that can sit next to and be a part of other residential projects. I think the retail market, we certainly see some changes going into the large box, large retail format spaces. And there's a difference between that retail drawing facility and then the commercial services that relate to it. So a Starbucks is different than a Nordstrom's. And so I think we want to really orchestrate and manage where those opportunities are happening, and how they're carefully integrated in, and understand the price points. So I think for the downtown area, it's looking like Class A and Class B space, and there will be opportunities for B and C as well. So I think there are an awful lot of opportunities. We're seeing more and more cultural changes, people wanting to drive less. You know, I just saw a guy go by on a briefcase and he was on an electric scooter. So I think we're seeing changes in transportation. People are more willing to live in a positive and safe and desirable downtown setting. And the setting of Walnut Creek is very different than the setting of downtown LA and downtown San Francisco. So I think it's got much more of the positives and much less of the negatives. So I think that's a great opportunity. And then, you know, it certainly requires, I think, partnership in marketing and partnership in attraction. So I'll end there.